I want to talk a little bit before we get to the interview with Stephen Weiner, our guest today, about what a train wreck the Queens County Surrogate Court is. This is just something that everyone who practices law in the New York area is aware of. Everyone knows that the New York Surrogate Court system is pretty Byzantine, and Stephen is going to explain that during our interview. But there is nothing like the Queens Court surrogate system. And I'm just going to take you through a selection of press reporting on this topic. Here's one. As you can see, it says the New York City Surrogates Court is broken. It should be fixed or abolished. The public administrator's office is part of political patronage in the judicial system. This is something called City and State New York, going back to October 2019. And I assure you that at that point, it was already very old news. Okay, that is tab number one here. Let's go to Gothamist, an online publication. Judge of 17 years, no match for the tangled web of Queens Surrogate Court. This is a 2020 article about a Pennsylvania judge who tried to act as an administrator for an estate in his family, for which he was evidently punished by the incumbent and outgoing surrogate, Peter Kelly, because that would have prevented the insider law firm from getting their fees. 2011, New York Times. Pity the poor Queens Democratic machine. A court, not votes, sustains a political machine in Queens. It talks about how Queens politicians have so consistently failed to deliver for their voters, and yet the Queens Democratic machine succeeds. Why? Because the Surrogates Court, otherwise known as Widows and Orphans Court, appoints guardians who make handsome fees processing the estates of those Queens residents who die without wills. Listen to what it says. To enter this court is to stumble upon Ponce de Leon's own spring, an eternal source of money for the politically wired. The Surrogates Court's judge appointed the public administrator Lois M. Rosenblatt, who is a fierce and battle-tested elections lawyer, Democratic division. Listen to this. Mr. Rosenblatt appointed the court's counsel, who for about a millennium has been Gerard J. Sweeney. In 2010, Mr. Sweeney's office pulled down almost $2.3 million in administration fees for estates. And they say it was a little bit slower in 2011. One law firm, one administrator. Gotham Gazette, 2017. Lawyers of color largely shut out of the Queens Surrogate Court's business. For decades, the judicial courts in Queens have been plagued by nepotism and patronage charges, with judges accused of awarding lucrative appointments to a select few. A demographic breakdown of the highest earning beneficiaries of surrogates court appointments over the past 7 years suggests that a pattern of favoritism may be creating a systemic barrier for lawyers of color and even amplifying racial disparities throughout the judicial system. 2012, how insiders snatch millions from estates in the scandal-scarred surrogates courts. This is what we're talking about. This is what Stephen Weiner has observed, experienced, and, as he will explain, is hoping to fix, at least in Queens, where it probably needs the most fixing. Hey, Culminators, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for joining us today. So today we're going to talk to someone who's doing something a little bit different, focusing on more of the local politics, more of the nitty-gritty of how things work, how money and politics, party politics, court politics work in a very large place, which is Queens County, New York. Stephen Weiner, a trust and estates attorney from Queens, who is running for the Queens County Surrogates Court. Stephen, welcome to ColemanNation.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
What's the story here, Stephen? Nice, a nice Jewish boy. You are you a lifetime Queens guy?
I'm longtime Queens, not all my life. I was born in a place called Glens Falls. And when my parents separated, my mom moved back to the Bronx to live with her mother. And I grew up in the Bronx. I went to Bronx High School of Science. We lived in a pretty tough neighborhood. And I went
You
on
went
from
to a
there. I
very
got a
demand. You went to a very selective high school, Bronx Science, but that didn't make
Yes.
it any less of a mean streets kind of experience being in that part of the Bronx.
No, my mom, helpfully, she moved closer to the high school from the neighborhoods further south where we lived. But I was used to taking the subway my whole life from a very young age at a time in the 60s and 70s when there was a lot of crime going on in the Bronx. And it's an interesting place. And I had an amazing opportunity when I was at Bronx Science. I became a member of the Speech and Debate Association. We had a very dedicated coach, and he took me and my debate partner, who became the top team at the school, all around the United States. And uh, after that, I received a scholarship to Yale and became president of the Yale Debate Association.
So I want
Uh,
to stop you for a second because I just want people who don't take it for granted as we do. What what could be achieved coming out of the New York City public school system in the 1960s and even early 1970s? Here's someone coming from a working class background, broken family. First, actually, I mean, most people aren't familiar with Bronx science. New York City has and had a number of selective public high schools. That's kind of an unusual thing, but it was meant as a way to deal with the fact that there were a lot of talented middle class students in New York City, and the idea was to give them as much opportunity to excel as possible. Um, you did so well, and you did so well at Bronx Science that you ended up at Yale on a full scholarship.
Partial scholarship, and I was asked to be the president of the Yale Debate Association. And just the way you come from, I came out of a background. My coach at Bronx Science had to teach me how to put a tie on. He did that for me, and I think my partner was able to do it maybe, but he had to show me how to put on a tie. And of course, that was the way speech and debate was done when I did it. It was more formal. People dressed up in high school and went around in these tournaments and were judged, and there were numerical judgments on how we did, both individually and as a team. And that's how they did it there. But that
So
takes me to the Yale, getting to Yale. What happened there?
that
Yeah.
gets you to Yale and it gives you something to do when you're not in the library at Yale.
Yes.
You must have spent some time in the library though, because you end up at Columbia Law School, which is a
Yes.
fairly competitive admissions uh, hurdle to overcome as well.
Yeah, I went to Columbia Law School. I was law review at Columbia, which is the highest academic journal at Columbia. Uh, I actually got on by means, my grades were good, but I actually got on by means of an anonymous writing competition. The part of the way to get on the law review Columbia was they did a writing competition, and the top three entries, which were totally anonymous, they didn't know who was writing them, got to be on the law review. It was on some issues of the federal constitutional law under equal protection. And I really, I put everything I had into this essay, and I was told, yeah, you're on the review.
No, that's not for nothing. I mean, that is an extremely valuable as I learned by virtue of not having gone out for law review, even though in retrospect I at Northwestern,
Yes.
you were presumptively on law review if you just did basically a pro forma application, if you had the kind of GPA that I had my first year. And I didn't even bother. I was so poorly advised. And when I say poorly advised, I don't mean to blame anyone. I mean, I got virtually no advice because I knew how to tie a tie, but that's about as far ahead of you as I was
All
in
right.
that
Yeah.
environment. So in any event, so coming out of Columbia as a law review editor, you must have had lots of choices.
Yes. I did do some work as a volunteer at the Harlem Legal Aid Society, which was a little unusual. I was the only person from my class in Columbia who was even there. And at the same time I was there, I had founded the Federalist Society at Columbia Law. I had gotten to know some conservative people at Yale,
So that's
and some
pretty
of those
early
people,
on. I mean, Federal Society is a fairly new thing. When you graduate Columbia in 84,
84,
85, 84.
84.
Okay, so because when I got to Northwestern and in 85, Federal Society was not brand new, but it was not much more than 4 or 5 years old, I think, in terms of any kind of organizational profile. So you must have been rubbing shoulders. Did you hang out with Randy Barnett at all, my friend?
I met Randy Barnett. Yes, I definitely heard him. I knew other people who were active in the Federal Society then. Their names were Spencer Abraham,
Sure, of course.
Lee Lieberman, who became Lee Lieberman Otis, Stephen Calabresi, and there was a whole bunch of people. I was there at a meeting where I think they technically founded the Federalist Society. It was at Yale Law School.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wasn't even a law student yet, but I was finishing Yale College, and they were founding the society. And I saw it happen in a room. There were about 10, 12 people there. And they said, we're going to start this. It was called the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy. That was the original name, but they dropped the last part. Anyway, there's always a story there. But when I went to
No one told me they
Columbia,
dropped the last part. I've been putting that on my on
oh,
my. I've been maybe it is. Maybe
maybe
they
they
dropped.
didn't. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go. Okay, I will ask you one thing. So most guys from backgrounds like ours, uh, second or third generation Ashkenazi, Jewish, middle class, guys in New York City would not necessarily be looking to join the Federal Society. I mean, I assume your whole family voted Democrat in those days, or am I wrong?
Yes, everybody was a Democrat. My mother, my father, they weren't together anymore, but they were Democrats, but they were kind of FDR type
Sure.
Democrats, the forgotten man was the slogan, I guess, and they were, and my mother liked Adlai Stevenson as well, she said to me, but they were kind of what you would call now more on the conservative or moderate side of the Democratic Party. And when I went to Yale, I said I was a Democrat, and I still was a Democrat. I didn't become a Republican until the 1990s during the Rudy Giuliani era, because that was my family. I was a Democrat. I grew up that way. Even if I voted for Ronald Reagan, I was still a Democrat.
It was
I
almost
couldn't let go.
it was almost a religious obligation.
Absolutely. It couldn't, yeah, it didn't seem right.
And people
When it
ask me
got
this, Steve, all the time. I mean, that's why I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry, but they want to know why are Jews so liberal? And I try to explain to them that being a Democrat is is deeply ingrained culturally, even though our
yes,
values, you know, I mean, what did you do right out of Columbia? You were volunteering for the Harlem Legal Aid Society, or Jewish people do that kind of thing. Okay, with a Columbia
right.
Law Review, you know, degree, you could have gone, I assume, directly into, even though the door wasn't quite as open for Jews in the white shoe firms as it would become over the next 10 years. I'm sure you had plenty of Wall Street type opportunities. But being a social justice kind of guy, caring about other people, the kind of thing you associate with Democrat Party kind of politics, you went for the nonprofit work.
Yeah, let me just stop you there because I don't want any misunderstanding. What happened? It was the summer of 1982. I was looking. I didn't have nowhere to go, so I saw an opening at the Harlem Legal Aid Society as
They
a
didn't have that
volunteer.
kind of on campus recruiting yet.
No,
Today you would be unable to walk out of you'd be unable to leave Columbia without a job.
yeah,
You know,
but I did get a Wall Street job. Let me just tell you
oh,
what
I would
happened. I
hope
did
so.
go. Yeah, I went to Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell,
Oh,
and I picked that
folks,
firm because I they
primo
were
primo primo firm, folks. Okay.
they were advertised as that one of the best firms. They were a Wall Street firm, but they had a reputation. It was known as tough Irish litigators. That was one of the things that was said about the firm. But I just wanted to be at a very top quality firm and to pay off my student loans, which I'd incurred in law school. That was part of it. And I
We're
went to
talking about
Cahill.
numbers, however, that listeners should understand are an order of magnitude lower, even adjusted for inflation. I mean, this was before the student loan scam, uh, that permeates and has distorted our society and our economy now is going on. I mean, I remember the when I started Princeton, that was my first introduction to private education. The comprehensive fee, which is tuition, room, and board, was still under $10,000.
Yeah, so it was relatively low. But I worked at Cahill and I learned a lot. And I was there a few years. And it was the 1980s. There was a lot going on in the legal world. And I had some great opportunities there. But I thought I wanted to be more hands-on and in the trenches. I was on teams on very big cases,
Yeah, those very
which was
big
a
firms,
compliment.
very big cases. It's really hard to learn unless you spend 20 years, and even then, you might not get into court. I remember there were
Right.
partners at Case Scholler, which is where I was in the beginning of my career, who had never seen a jury. People who were corner office partners had never done first chair in a jury trial.
Exactly. So I said, I want to get further into the process. So I went to a firm at that time, it was called Sheriff Friedman.
Sheriff
Uh,
Friedman, sure, I know Sheriff Friedman.
yeah.
I went to
And
camp with Charlie Sheriff, who
exactly.
was the son of one of the partners.
Yeah. And it was a good firm, and they were doing some you would call it was merger and acquisition work. It was the era of the hostile takeover, of the proxy fight. And there were some former U.S. attorneys or people who had been at the U.S. Attorney Office in the Southern District who were very quality attorneys who I worked for there. It was intense. And I was there until about 19, my last lateral move. I ran into people from Schulte, Roth, and Zabel. And they said, if you want to work at a firm, you're at a good firm, but you want to work at a great firm. Yeah, it was that kind of a thing. You have one more lateral move you can make as a senior associate in litigation.
So
Come to
Schulte had just
Schulte.
about, and they were Case Scholler alumni there.
Probably, yeah, I think they
Yeah,
were
I
too.
mean, the firm had just probably just been starting out. Schulte Roth today is really known for its hedge fund work.
Yes.
In those days, it was like a kind of a mini Case Scholler, litigation, real estate, all the things, an up and coming, you know, high quality white shoe firm.
Yes. So I went over there. My last lateral move, I was a senior associate. I worked there for years on multi-district federal litigation involving the RICO statute and other kinds of intense, it was federal work, all federal work.
So here you are doing litigation work. We don't have to go into every every move you made, but here we are 20 years, 30 years later, and you're doing trust and estates.
Yes. What happened?
What happened? What I mean, that is a big change. I mean, I've done some estate litigation, but it's such a different temperament and it's such a different pace. And so how'd that happen?
It's a different world. The first case that was referred to me when I left Schulte was by Bill Zabel, the head of the Trust and Estates Department. He referred Mrs. Kiki Kozinski. She was the widow of the author, Jerzy Kozinski, in
Oh,
a trust and estate case. So my
right.
first referral coming out of the world of litigation, going into it was my own practice that I was going into actually. I decided to open up on my own. Uh, was this widow, and it was renegotiating her trust with, I forget which of the major law firms it was, but it was a very large, important law firm that had done this trust, and the widow was not getting enough income. Most of the principal and the income was being preserved for a college in Illinois, and I had to negotiate with them to get her a better deal, which happened, thank God. And I did some trust and estate work as I ran my own practice. I was a litigator primarily, but there was a little trust and estates in there as and other kinds of litigation that I hadn't touched at the big firms and appellate work. And the way I got into trust and estates in a heavy way was really, it was really around 2001. And what happened there is I had been involved in the political world a little bit. I had gotten involved in the Rudy Giuliani campaign. I'd gotten introduced to the political world. And at some point, I got a letter of introduction to the then surrogate judge of Queens. His name was Robert Nauman. And he said, "Would you like to try some work at the surrogate court, guardian ad litem work?" And around 2001, I got over 10 assignments of cases from the court. Right? And that's where I started working in the surrogate court in Queens. I was still running my own practice, but these were a sort of outside contractor kind of cases. I'd be brought in to represent people who had heirs were missing, or there was an infant, some minor who didn't have an attorney, and I'd be appointed from the bench by the surrogate back then. "Mr. Weiner, do you want to take this case?" And I would say, "Yes, Your Honor, I will take it, and I'll work on this case." And I got introduced to the court, and I saw the way that surrogates courts operated. It was a more civil, lower key, collegial kind of court in general, I would say. It's say in general, in a lot of aspects. And I decided, I like this kind of work. I want to, and now I started beginning my estate planning side. I spoke to some of my adversaries and I said, how do I get into this practice in a more heavy way? And it was suggested I go to, which I did, to the New York State Society of CPAs estate planning monthly meetings. I started attending their monthly meetings. I joined the Trust and Estate Committee of the New York State Bar. And I realized that just in terms of my personality and where I wanted my life to head, this was the direction I wanted to go.
You do seem, if I can say so, more of a trust and estates kind of guy than a
Yes.
litigation kind of guy.
Yes, it really is. I mean, I've had my experiences. I did have trials where my adversary was pounding on the desk with me. I mean, that's a little bit of the caricature. That's not all litigators. And I won that jury trial because I was the nice guy and the jury
Yeah,
saw
that's
me
right.
and I was right. I was right. I had the right case. But the other side of it was, yeah, it's a kind of it can be a very gut-wrenching, harrowing experience, 18 hours a day in trial preparation. I've been there many times. And I thought, if I can provide this service, that I like, what I like about the estate planning side is I'm giving people something they really need, want. It's not about working out conflicts in the family that are just, some of them are deep-seated conflicts that aren't even about litigation. They're about something else, emotional. I'll say that.
So here we are now. You get it, and you were obviously you succeeded in being admitted into the club, right? I mean, there's a mafia in the surrogates.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me say, I was sort of an outsider. I was a Republican by then. And yeah, they let me in to see. It was sort of like the window opened. It was a short time. It closed when Peter Kelly became the surrogate. There were no more assignments for me, which was okay. I didn't make a protest. That was fine. That ended. I guess he went exclusively with the Democratic Party at that point. And so my time as an assigned counsel ended, but I had developed my own private surrogate and trust and estate practice uh, because thank God I had the experience of seeing how it worked and what could be done.
And even if you weren't a member of the mafia anymore, you were you knew your way around. You knew who
I
to
knew
talk.
it. I knew it even more. I knew how to talk. At one point, I was election commissioner of Queens as a Republican. So I saw the inside of the political world. And I was also president of the New York City Board of Elections for 1 year.
Well, you really do have
Again,
an
as a private
appetite.
attorney.
You have an appetite for abuse.
I got it. I got it big time. Eventually, after 7 years as commissioner of elections, I said, that's enough. It was 2004, in the middle of the Bloomberg era. I said, I've had enough. Basically, they said it's the lowest paid commission in New York State, being an election commissioner. And the time and the abuse, they got more abusive. I saw the process kind of get worse over time.
Explain to listeners, if you will, what the surrogates court does in New York.
All right. Okay, very important. When a person dies, they can come in, their family is looking at the situation. Of course, they're in mourning, they're grieving, but there's also an issue of property. If there is property in the name of the deceased, that has to be dealt with in one way or another, either through a last will and testament or through a trust, or if there has been no documentation giving the wishes of the deceased, then people who are called distributees, those would be the people who, under the law of New York, would inherit without a will or without a trust. Those people have to show up in surrogate court and be do a petition to become administrators of the estate. Surrogate means representative. So this is a court for representatives of the deceased primarily, but it also does guardianships for special needs people, and it also does adoptions. It shares that jurisdiction with some other courts, the adoption jurisdiction, but it does that as well. So that's the spectrum of what the surrogate does. It's a specialized court.
So the surrogates court, but isn't it the case? Sounds like I'm setting you up for a cross-examination question. That the surrogates court system, the surrogacy system in New York is a little bit more arcane than in other states.
Yes, it is. I'm told, for example, in New Jersey, and I'm not an expert on New Jersey, okay, but I'm told there are situations where people can go into the county offices and have estate materials processed, very quickly, very seamlessly, not even requiring court orders in some cases, and everything is done. Here, everything has to be subject to a decree of a judge, the surrogate. Uh, there's also a whole other piece, by the way, the most politicized piece of the surrogate court, because your listeners are going to be interested in this, is the Office of Public Administrator. It's a very important fact. If there's property where let's say nobody steps forward to be a representative and there is valuable property, there is a house, there is an apartment building, there is a business, there's something going on where there's a lot of money at stake and no representative is showing up. It doesn't necessarily just sit there. It's reported to something called the Office of the Public Administrator, which there's one for every surrogate. Every surrogate actually can hire and fire this official called the public administrator of the county, who handles the public administration of the effects of deceased people. And that public administrator in Queens happens to have as his attorney the most prominent Democratic election law firm in Queens County, a famous law firm. It's been the same law firm for 30 years at least. And the firm makes, and it's publicly reported, millions and millions of dollars on the public administration work. And that work is, of course, protected by the surrogate, who, if the surrogate comes through a political operation, the surrogate will protect the public administrator, or with the agreement of the organization, pick the public administrator. And that in turn will safeguard the law firm and the money. And it's not just the law firm. The law firm hires appraisers, real estate brokers. That the property has to be sold after all. But where do these brokers come from?
But
Where do the
does this
appraisers?
only affect intestate decedents or no?
The public administrator can do more than affect, not just intestate. Well, let's say it certainly. Let let me just qualify that a little bit. Intestate, in the sense, if there's no will, the public administrator comes in. Yeah, it's an administration. So if there is a will, the public administrator would not come in unless there's a fight in the family that's so bad that they say, we can't stand it. I don't want this one. I don't want that one. And eventually the surrogate says, okay, would you like the public administrator to handle the estate? So it could happen if there's a big fight and no one will administer who would naturally administer. But I had a case taken away from me. I had to go to a public administrator. It's an interesting story about how these things happen in Queens. And I can tell you about it if you have the time. I don't know if you
Yeah,
do.
you can tell us, sure. What I
Okay.
find, Stephen, is that people, stuff that we find really, you know, workaday, people really are fascinated by how the sausage gets made.
Yeah, well, let me tell you how it happens. I meet a gentleman whose domestic partner died, and he could not inherit anything because he wasn't married to his longtime domestic partner. And it turned out that there were some relatives who could inherit, who I was introduced to, who lived out of New York State. I'd say two sisters and a brother. There's about $1.5 million of property involved. And I helped them. There was no will. And I helped somebody become the administrator of the estate. And when the surrogate of Queens appointed her administrator, he said, I'll make you the administrator, but you have to post a bond for $450,000. Now, she didn't have the financial wherewithal to do it. And we couldn't get any bonding company. That's what they use in
Explain
these
the purpose of
situations.
a bond. Why would it be necessary under neutral circumstances to require an administrator to post a bond?
Yeah, the bond would usually be required because there'd be a concern that there might be a minor involved or somebody else who might not be taken care of properly by this administrator. So the surrogate would say, well, I'm concerned, given the circumstances here, that if the administrator were to walk off with the money, there would be a bond from a third party company who would ensure, in effect, that people inherit. So the bond is to preserve the inheritance of people.
But that sounds a little crazy. I mean, the whole idea is you're appointing people who presumably have been vetted, who are lawyers and could lose their ability to make a living if they were to even so much as mixed, mingle funds from one trust into another or into their operating accounts. On top of that, there's a bond requirement. Is that really meant as a barrier to entry into this game to some extent?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what it did here. This is an unusual one where I found out something that was under the radar here. I inquired, why is there a bond being required here? You basically have you have two sisters. Oh, you got me there. You have a sister, two sisters, and a brother, and one sister, with the consent, by the way, of her brother and sister, she's going to be the administrator. So I said, why is he requiring a bond? And the bonding companies told me, they said, this surrogate, he's got a rule. If there's an out-of-state administrator, she doesn't live in New York, she lives in Arizona, and you're a solo practitioner, Mr. Weiner, which I am, then he's going to require a bond. And I said, well, it didn't make any sense to me. That rule doesn't make any sense because I'm, a longstanding practicing New York attorney. This is a normal person and who happens to live in Phoenix, Arizona. Why should she be treated worse than a person who lives in Queens? Why should I be treated worse than a two-person law firm? None of that made any sense. But what ended up happening is I had to go to this person because she could not come up with a bond. Her family members couldn't come up with a bond. I ultimately had to say to her, look, you're unable to administer this estate. I think there's only one alternative. And what do you think that is? What did he leave us with as the only alternative? We had to go to the public administrator, who now gets $1.5 million estate. She gets, it's not a huge percentage, but she gets a cut. And the law firm takes over. And there's a postscript. After I arranged all this for my client, I was very sorry to see her go. I heard from her, it was about a year later. I had been in communication with the public administrator's office and we handed the file over and everything over. And she said to me, no, nothing's happened. Nothing's happened. They haven't done anything. So I reached out, she reached out. Eventually something happened, let's say months later. But for over a year, these three people who had very little money didn't get anything out of the $1.5 million that should have come to them. And still the cut will go to the law firm and the public administrator of Queens. I want to change this. Okay, this is part of, look, I see it. This is
Segue
just
time.
one
Perfect.
case.
Thank you. Okay.
One case. I want to come in. I want to see why is it taking so long? I've had complaints from people all over the county. It's taken 15 months to have an ordinary case processed. One of them said, I've been in surrogate court in Queens for 7 years. I don't know what is going on. Why is this happening to me? I've had people with other time periods. I had a case, just to give your listeners a contrast. I had a Rockland County surrogate case for two sons who were inheriting from their father. They said, how long will it take for us to process this? You're our attorney. How long is it going to take for you to do it? Same law in Rockland as in Queens. I said to them about 3 months. It took about 3 months.
Because
That's
it was
Rockland. It was Rockland, not Queens. And so there is something about the process, maybe people get to jump ahead in the line. There may be more that I find when I get in there as surrogate. I want to get to the bottom of why it takes this long to process the cases, that I know the issues involved, and I want to get in and understand, what is the internal processes and procedures that make them slower in Queens than they ought to be and make it work better.
Now,
And that's one. Yeah, go ahead.
well, is there sort of, I would suspect that with God's help, let's say you win this election, you get people to, and there are, I think, more people even in New York who are looking at the ticket, in the automatic Democrat party line vote differently this year than they have in the past, or from how they have in the past. So let's say you win. Do you still have to worry about a sort of a deep state in the surrogates court? In other words, is it going to be possible, you think, for merely by virtue of being surrogate court judge to make changes given the political and administrative structure that's been in place for all these decades?
Well, yes, there is a deep state, I will say, and there are about 50
A deep
people
county.
working at the court. In Queens County Surrogate Court, there's 50 people working there. There are rules that have to be followed. There's civil service rules. There are people who have probably been, grandfathered or kept there who don't do the work, that have been there because of the political world. And I have to follow the rules and the civil service laws of the state of New York to a
Snapshot
T.
again for people who aren't familiar with civil service rules in New York and what that means in terms of an administrator's ability to hire and fire staff.
Yeah, exactly. But there is something significant. One of the things that I would do when I come in is I would interview the public administrator. And this is a person who came out of, the political world. And Basically, it's almost like meeting with the FBI. I hate to, I don't want to overemphasize who I am, but it's sort of like meeting with the FBI director if you're president of the United States, and you sort of, this is a person you could terminate. I can terminate legally, I could terminate the public administrator, but it is like the FBI director that this person has a lot of responsibility. Oh my goodness, I could imagine if I had to terminate the person, there would be hell to pay, as they say, in terms of the press. What the heck is this guy doing? But what I would want to do is see, what is necessary to get rid of rules that simply, that don't benefit the people of Queens, but maybe enrich the Democratic Party indirectly. If that's what it's about, that's got to go. Okay. And that's a hill I'm willing to, fight on or die on to end things. If it's bonding practices or, limiting who is in the universe of who could be hired to assist the court. And if it's only for the benefit of the party, that would have to go. I want to run the court in a clean, public spirited way. And if it took having to let go the public administrator and bring in a new person who would be somebody who is absolutely exceptional, that's what I would want to have happen, an interview process, a vetting process. And that would necessarily, I think, it wouldn't guarantee that that law firm that controls all of the surrogate court work would be gone. But I'd begin the process of looking into let me give you an example. There's another county, Brooklyn, that's also run by the Democratic Party. They have multiple law firms handling the same kind of work that this one law firm has. So even moving to a more enlightened political partisan model, you would have a different arrangement of legal representation than you have here. If that firm, should stay in some capacity or not, I'd have to make a call as an attorney, as a responsible person who wants to make sure the work is continued. Maybe they should stay in some way or another. But these are all calls I'd have to make. But the deep state is, look, that law firm is a very, entrenched. They're running the cases, and you know what it is. If you want to change counsel in midstream, there's a cost to that. The people of Queens might lose the continuity of the legal background, understanding in some legitimate cases. I don't want to hurt the people, but on the other hand, I'm not going in to keep the status quo. And I guess that's my ultimate difference with my opponent. She's basically coming in through the organization to maintain the status quo, and I want to change it.
Is she being supported by the incumbent law firm?
Well, I don't know if they're contributing, but I know that, and this is well known, she was supported by the head of the Queens Democratic Party, Greg Meeks. She didn't come out of a bar committee because she's not a wills, trust, and estate attorney.
Really?
She's had a meteoric career, almost like other people's meteoric career you may have heard about in the news. She was working as a court referee. About 3 or 4 years ago, she became a civil court judge with the support of Mr. Meeks. And then she became a Supreme Court judge a little more than a year ago. So her bench experience is about 3 years.
That doesn't mean, folks, that doesn't mean Supreme Court, Supreme Court. Remember, in New York State, the Supreme Court is the court of general's jurisdiction for civil and criminal matters. It's higher than the civil court, but it's not the state's highest court. The state's highest court in New York is the New York Court of Appeals. But nonetheless, that's a fairly meteoric rise to go from civil court judge to Supreme Court judge in 3 years.
Yeah, and if you think about it, we're talking about courts that have 10-year terms. So she became elected about 3 years ago to a 10-year term for civil court, but she didn't finish that term. In less than half of that term, she was running again for Supreme Court. And okay, and then she got elected to Supreme Court. And now, after a little more than a year of a 10-year term, she wants to move to a court that does a completely different set of legal deals with a different set of legal issues. So think about those career moves. You know, you have somebody who sort of says, I'm a trust and estate. You know, I'm a personal injury attorney. I'm now going to go to a tax firm. Okay, now I'm at the tax firm. I'm going to go to the bankruptcy firm. You know, you kind of wonder what's going on. Uh, some layperson was trying to tell me, how do you explain this better to people? He said, sort of like, Stephen, you're like a heart doctor. Okay, you know, we're heart doctors in a sense of trust, wills, and estate attorneys. She's sort of a podiatrist. She does other kinds of law. She's not a wills, trust, and estate attorney. She wants to go to the court that deals with cardiology. So what's going on now? And I guess the other contrast, you know, obviously she's younger than me. She was admitted to practice in New York in 2007. I was admitted in 1985. You know, so there are other differences there too. Yeah, you can see she had a tremendous primary. That was something else that happened. This is very unusual. This was it hasn't happened apparently in decades in the Democratic Party. This My opponent was primaried by another civil court judge on the grounds that a machine is running the surrogate court in Queens. That's what my opponent said. The court's under the control of the machine. She wanted to make reforms. One of the things she mentioned, which I really admire also, is improving translation services. What I found is there's a lot of concern in the some of the communities in Queens. There's not sufficient translation for people from China, from other parts of Asia, and you know, there's a lot of difficulty with that with the court. It's not adapting fast enough.
Well, I mean, I know this sounds like kind of an obvious question, but why does it matter that she doesn't have a background in estates and trust law?
Well, the reason is that a lot of the issues that the surrogate deals with have to do with some intense, recurring factual situations, like does a person have capacity to do a will? And that means they have the mental soundness of mind to know who their family is, what assets they have, or what's actually in the will. Do they understand what's going on? And I've had to make those judgment calls as an attorney. I've gone to hospitals, into people's bedsides, and taken care of families where there are people who are not well, but maybe still mentally sound. So she
And
doesn't
this
have that experience.
and this is on top of learning a body of law that you've been involved in for at least 20 years.
Exactly. And the same thing applies to undue influence. You know, when is it that a family's concern or involvement rises to the level of pressuring a person to a point they're doing what they really don't want to do? So that's all coming from 20 years of experience plus, which my adversary or opponent, she doesn't have the benefit of that experience. So it's all going to be very theoretical. It's all going to be presented to her as, Your Honor, this is what we think. It'll be people writing memos, and she won't have the personal background in the field of law to draw on to say, is this right? Or what cross-examination question should I ask next? Once you have people on the stand, the judges generally don't direct the trial or the hearing, but they get to ask questions. And if you don't have that background, you don't know what you're looking for.
Well, not only that, they rule on evidentiary objections, and you can't rule on relevancy if you don't have an not just know, but you have to have an instinctive understanding of what are the elements of diminished capacity, what are the elements of undue influence, what are the elements of testamentary intent, what are the elements of uh, you know when a person is a natural a natural object of someone's beneficiary intent. All these things that come up, and again, I've done a little bit, so I know some of the buzzwords. It's hairy business. And then there's the accounting stuff, for goodness
Ah,
sake. Oh,
yeah,
don't get
I've worked on guardianships as a court-appointed guardian, court examiner since 2004. And I've seen accountings every year and continuously. I've been reappointed, as a court examiner, and I know about the way the accounting, should run, the process should run. And again, that's something that I've decades of experience in.
People often say, "Well, politics is local." We have a very strong emphasis on talking about national issues and culture war issues. But, I had the opportunity once to appear on Lee Smith's book podcast, and he said, "Ron, what book would you like to talk about?" And I said, "Let's talk about uh, The Power Broker, the book about Robert Moses." And you cannot understand how the world works, how the building in which you go to vote came to be, and how it is that you got to get there, and what other powers and forces influence you, uh, if you only focus on national stuff. The thing that Robert Moses understood was how to get into the gears, how to get into the guts and the language of statutes and bonds and stuff like that in order to exert tremendous amount of power. And the Queens Surrogate Court is one of those examples of where government is really not working. And I appreciate you. One more point I want to actually raise is you're actually going to age out of the term of this.
Yes, and I'm trying to tell people why that's a good thing.
No,
Okay,
I think I understand why it's a good thing, but I'll let you
you get
explain
it.
it.
Okay, when I be if when I become surrogate, God willing, Baruch Hashem, I would have 4 years because there's a mandatory retirement for surrogate of age 70. The term, and a lot of people are shocked when they hear this, the term of the surrogate in New York County and in Queens is 14 years. So that's why, basically after 4 years of what my argument would be, I would be reform surrogate. Okay, I would clean up the court, make it run efficiently, make it run fairly and compassionately, and I have 4 years to do it. That's the term that a governor has, the U.S. president has. It's a normal term. Okay. Uh, and then there's a choice. There'll be a new election in 4 years for surrogate, and people can put the best person in. Okay. That's what I offer. On the other side, we have my opponent who's really come out of through a political machine process, and she's ready to walk into a 14-year term. And she's young enough to sit there for the full 14 years. And there'll be no opportunity to vote on improving the court for another 14 years. And it was a gift to me, because I'd been involved a little in the political process under Rudy Giuliani, and I'd seen how it worked, and I knew the significance of the court. I was one of the few people who could see when there was an opening. I went to the parties. I said, please nominate me. This is important. We need to do something here. That's how it happened. I didn't get tapped by them. I went to the parties and said, we need to put up a candidate. And I even said, if you pick somebody qualified and it's not me, I'll support that person. Okay. So I was willing to step aside if they would only pick a qualified person and not leave it an uncontested seat, which is what happens in New York many times when the Democrat is running. So that's the bottom line. I think it's that my having the mandatory retire out in 4 years gives a choice. The 14-year to somebody who's not a trust and estate attorney, that's really not only an injustice, it's a disservice. And who knows what'll happen if we'll ever fix this court. Thank you.
It seems really unlikely that almost anything gets fixed in New York, especially where there's so much money to be made. But Stephen Weiner, thanks for explaining this to us. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, to get to know you a little bit. And hopefully we get some people to listen in and realize that even if you're a New Yorker, even if you're Jewish, even if you're African American, whatever constituency it is that you believe requires you to vote Democratic, you can consider the candidates themselves. You have that option. And Stephen Weiner might be someone whose program and whose background might appeal to you. Great talking to you. Have a good Yom Tov. Thank you, Stephen. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.